there's that. Oh, is that good, Alice?
Yeah.
Is that good? Cool, there we go. Okay, so just a couple of announcements. First of all, we have 2 more classes after tonight. Then we'll be finished with Matthew. There's a sign-up sheet going around for Hebrews, which is what we're going to do in the fall. If you would like a workbook for Hebrews, put your name, your phone number, and the type of workbook you want, whether it's an in and out or a precept upon precept. And then that way I kind of have a rough estimate of what to order for the fall. But I will text everyone before I order and make sure that everyone has the workbook that they would like for the fall. Second, if you are interested in doing the class and the temple tour for the Syracuse Temple next Saturday, if you want to do the temple tour, make sure you get a hold of Ken or myself so we can direct you to the website to put your name on the list off the website. If you do not want to go on the tour, but you still want to come to the class, please come, because you can still ask all kinds of questions to your neighbors, your friends, all of that through the information that Mark Parsons is going to give with the Truth and Love. So the class starts at 2 o'clock. It'll go till about 5. Then if you're planning, if you signed up for the temple tour, we'll all meet at the Syracuse Temple at 6:15. The first group of people will go through at 6:30, and then the second group will go through at 6:45. Chris?
If we sign that sheet, do we need to get on some kind of?
If you signed the sheet, Ken already transferred all of your names
Okay.
to the online list.
Okay.
Okay. Then thirdly,
Where's that temple located? I can't, do you have the address?
It's hard to find.
25.
Yeah, as soon as you get about 3 feet, man, all you gotta do is home in on the lights.
yeah, you can see it from Antelope.
Okay.
Yeah.
Grab and see it from Idaho, can't you?
Just casual is what it says on the website. So yeah. So yeah, casual dress is what it says on the LDS website for attire. So that's what we're going with. So yeah. Lastly, I'm thinking that we might do, I haven't done this for a long time, but I'm thinking that I might do a class in June at night. So I don't know for sure if it'll be Monday night or Thursday night, but the class is going to be on how to understand biblical genres better. And so we will be going through the book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And that would probably be a 4-week class. So the only thing you would need is just the book. But the closer that gets to being all decided and all that kind of thing, I'll let everybody know.
Who wrote that book?
A guy named Gordon. He's the primary author, I
But
think.
not Gordon Hebrew.
Gordon and Stewart or something like that, yeah. Yeah, the book's been around for a long time. It's usually on a required seminary reading list, but it's just to help us understand how to look at and understand the different genres in the Bible. So with that being said, guys, we're going to jump in, but I'm going to warn you even before the fact, because I know you're going to think, yeah, there's no way. I know you were all thinking this when you were going through your homework this week. There's no way we're going to get through this. We're going to try our hardest, but we are going to go late. So with that being said, let's jump in.
How many woes did you get through last week?
4.
Oh, you got through 4?
We got through 4.
You got 2.
Whoa.
I left you.
Yeah, we did. We got through
Whoa.
4. Whoa, that's right. You're also clever.
Jay's on
Yeah.
one tonight.
Okay, so last week, where did we leave Jesus?
In chapter 23.
Right, in chapter 23. Talking to the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians. Where is he physically at in these chapters? In Jerusalem. Whereabouts in Jerusalem? In the temple, right? And so what we saw is that this day started out with him coming into the temple. They decided they're going to try to catch him and test him and all these things. But has the day turned out as well for them as what they had anticipated when they started their questioning? No. And what we see in chapter 23 is that Jesus actually kind of turns the tables on them now, and he's like, okay, you've been doing all this questioning with me. He asks them a question about who is the Messiah in regards to David's son, and they wouldn't answer. And so then he turns to the people and he starts telling the people about the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, what did he tell them at the beginning of chapter 23 about the scribes and the Pharisees? They're hypocrites, but what did he, because they hold a place of authority when they're teaching through the Torah and all of that, he said to listen to what they say when they sit in the seat of Moses, but do not do what? Do not do what they do. They don't do anything that they say that they're supposed to do. And so what we saw is that Jesus attaches this word hypocrite to the woes. Now, hypocrite, remember, means two-faced. But as Jesus is using it here, that two-faced, that description is seen by their inconsistency, right? That they tell people to do one thing and then they turn around and do something else, right? So we started with woe number 1 in verse 13. What did that woe talk about?
They're keeping people from getting close to God.
Keeping people from getting close to God, right? So because they won't come into the kingdom, they're actively opposing others coming into the kingdom, and so Jesus says that they're going to be judged for that. Then the second woe was in regards to what? Well, in verse 14, remember we have this woe about how they're treating who? The widows, how they're stealing the widows' homes and throwing them out on the street. But yet, when they're in public, what kind of prayers do they do? These long prayers, these profound prayers. Okay. Then in verse 15, what is the third woe? That's the one about making the proselytes, right? So they find these people who really want to know God, they want to serve God, they want to know what it means to be part of a community that worships the living God. And it says, and you take that person and you make them twice the son of hell that you are. So what did he mean by that?
They give them false doctrine?
No.
Oh, they teach them their increase of the word.
They teach them their understanding of what it is with the laws and with all of that kind of thing like we talked about. But instead of just telling them to keep the Sabbath in the way that Moses told them to keep the Sabbath, what they would say is, no, you need to keep the Sabbath with that and all of these other things, right? This legalism. But the problem is that those proselytes are so eager to serve God that do the proselytes live by every single thing that they say? They do. They try really hard. They try even harder than the person who told them how to live that way. And so he says, because of this, what you do is you make them twice the son of hell that you are, which is a scathing condemnation, right? So then woe number 4 was about what? The oaths that they take and how they bind themselves with oaths. And they were saying that certain oaths, if you swore by the temple or by the altar, those oaths didn't really count. You could break those oaths. But if you swear by the gold in the temple or by the offering on the altar or things like that, then those were the ones that you were bound to. And Jesus says, no, you're bound to an oath, any kind of oath that you make on something sacred that represents God, you're bound to that oath, right? You can't pick and choose. And so he tells them that they need to do this. So then we get to woe number 5, right, in verse 23. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. So what is he judging them on here?
That the getting the tithe is more important than carrying out
Right.
the word of God.
They care about, and what is the weightier thing here? Now, is tithing commanded in the Word? Tithing is commanded in the Old Testament. But what kind of tithing is Jesus talking about here?
Well, it's a hard thing. Again, it's always a hard thing.
Okay, but is this the big, like, bring in the 10% of your harvest or anything like that? What is the tithing of these things represent?
Legalism.
Legalism. That, like, they're so legalistic about tithing what they need to tithe on an ounce of mint or something like that. They're so precise and so legalistic about that, but what do they entirely miss?
Unmerciful.
Justice, mercy, compassion. And Jesus says these are the weightier things that they should be concerned about in the law, not the tithing of their kitchen herbs, right? So once again, he makes that contrast of what's more important in their eyes versus what's more important in God's eyes. Now, remember, why is he talking directly to the scribes here? Why is he not saying all of this to the crowd? Why does he say, you scribes are hypocrites? They're the people who are supposed to know the law. They're the people who are responsible for copying the law and looking at the law. So if anyone should have a correct understanding of the law, it's them, right? And do you see with each one of the woes, the inconsistencies that Jesus is showing them? Okay. So then he goes on to the next one. And he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. Now, do you remember when we talked about the Sabbath? Remember chapters ago when they come to Jesus and his disciples and say, why are your disciples not keeping the Sabbath? And why don't they wash their hands before they eat? And why don't they do all of those things? What is this woe in regards to? Is it in regards to them keeping the actual law of God? Or is it in regards to their maintaining the traditions of the elders? Because what were the washings of the cups and all of that?
That's something they made up, that was added to.
Yeah.
That was, what'd you call it, Corbin? It's added, it's
Right.
added to what was.
It's added to what was in the law. And they're so concerned about that, but in their hearts and in their actions, what are they actually doing? He says you are full of robbery and self-indulgence. Right? Yeah, so what he's basically talking about, robbery is an act of violence. That's an act of violence upon somebody. So he basically is telling them that what you have done is that you have gotten away with acts of violence and selfishness because you're so concerned that people watch what you do to the outside, that they never question what you're doing and what your heart is like. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I read through these woes, I think that the condition of someone who has spiritual authority has not changed from when Jesus spoke this to those scribes till now.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't at all.
If people are not careful with the authority that they are given spiritually, it can be a powerful weapon. So that you can steal something from someone, you can act selfishly, you can abuse them, you can hurt them, you can sell their property, you can accuse them of all kinds of things. But on the outside, what do you look like? You look so holy, right? So clean. But Jesus says inwardly, you're not. And he's going to build on that woe with the next one, because he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of what? Dead men's bones and uncleanness. Right? Now, this was part of their religious ritual, and Jesus is he's gonna build on this in a minute when he talks to them about the prophets. But they took great care in maintaining the tombs of the prophets, or the tombs of the kings, or the tombs of the fathers, or things like that. And so they would make sure that they looked nice, that they were kept up. But he says, you're like that in that you look good on the outside, but inwardly, what are you?
Whitewashed tombs.
You're dead. You are unclean. This is so, now think about what they thought when they heard this, because it was a bad thing to be unclean, right? To be unclean meant that you had to go through some kind of process to be clean again. There was a whole ritual that you had to go through. And so Jesus, what is he telling them about how they see themselves? Do they see themselves as clean in the eyes of God?
They do.
They're ceremonially clean, they're religiously clean, they're sacrificially clean, they're clean. But what does Jesus say?
You're not.
You're not. You're actually unclean on the inside. And then he goes on and he says, so you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So, what is this woe?
Blindness.
Okay, well, it's
lies. It's like, it's a,
They let John get his blood shed.
okay, see, this is what's really interesting about this. Because Jesus calls them on this thing, oh, you take so much care of adorning the prophets' tombs and, doing all of this kind of thing. And you say to yourselves, if we had lived when our fathers lived, we would never have done that. We would have understood the word of God. We would never have treated the prophets the way that our fathers treated the prophet. And Mikey's right. What did they let just occur probably a year before this? They let John the Baptist be beheaded. You don't see any place where the Pharisees and scribes or anybody's going to Herod and saying, hey, you need to not, be careful of how you treat John or anything like that. No one came to stand up for John when Herod has him in prison. And what are they secretly plotting right now? Jesus' death. And I think what's really interesting about this is that when Jesus came into the city, what did the people say? And even as Jesus has been walking around the city this whole week, how do the common people see Jesus? As a prophet. So when Jesus calls them on this, you almost wonder if they're not standing there going, how does he know? Right? And this is what he talks about. They stand in judgment of the actions of their fathers and say they would never do anything like that. But as they're speaking, Jesus is speaking to them, they are actually in the process of doing the exact same thing. And so he says to them, he says, so you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Now, I think this is really interesting because we just talked about John, and even though Matthew doesn't mention this, what had John told the scribes and the Pharisees when they came to him?
Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come.
You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming judgment? I don't think it's by accident that Jesus says that to them. Because what had John been telling them? The exact same thing. This prophet that the people recognize, remember, because when Jesus asked them about John, do you remember they go through that whole thought process of, well, if we say that he was truly a prophet, then he's going to come back and say, well, then why didn't you follow him? But if we say that he wasn't a prophet, that he just had a ministry from men, then the people are going to rebel because the people think he was a great prophet. And I think this is why Jesus uses this statement here, is that it's this understanding of this last prophet that they've had, and he's dead, and he says, you're the same as your fathers were. So he says, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. You know, I think so many times that we think prophets just kind of did their thing, and then they just kind of moseyed off into the sunset, and they just died at a ripe old age, and nothing bad really ever happened to them, right? And even when we read the Old Testament prophets, the only one that we're ever told about what happened to him in his old age is Jeremiah. When they kidnap him and take him to Egypt, right? But here, what does Jesus say is the lot of a prophet? A violent death at the hands of the people that you were sent to prophesy to. Now, this is so amazing because we are only a couple of days from Passover when Jesus is talking about this. And he says, you know what, in your arrogance, all of that guilt from the prophets, from Abel to now, because of what you're going to do, you're going to bear all of that blood guilt on yourselves. And then he pronounces judgment on who? On who in verse 36. He says, truly I say to you, all of these things will come upon who? This generation. Right? Now remember that for when we go into the next couple of chapters. But then he pronounces judgment on where? Jerusalem. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, the judgment is on Jerusalem because of what?
Their unwillingness.
Their unwillingness to come to repentance, right? And so he says, you, Jerusalem, in a sense, what Jesus is saying is Jerusalem is Jerusalem. It's always the same. Remember during the time of Jeremiah and Hezekiah and all of those, Josiah, Jerusalem never ever fully came to repentance ever with anything. And so he says that this unwillingness to come to repentance is going to be their judgment now. And he says that their house is empty. He says your house is being left to you desolate. What house?
The temple.
The temple. Right? This whole week, who's been in the temple teaching, answering their questions, doing all of that kind of stuff? Christ has. He came in, he cleansed the temple, we had the whole discussion of authority, we had all of that kind of thing. And now, when we get to the beginning of chapter 24, what we see is that Jesus has left the temple, right? And he's basically telling them that he's not going to come back again until he comes in the manner that they will once again say, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Right? So this is the end of that day. So, any thoughts or questions before we move on to 24? Chris?
I thought it was interesting that he went all the way back to Abel, the first murder.
Yeah. Because Abel stood for what was right and spoke for God. And so, yeah, it's interesting that he does go all the way back there to the last prophet before the intertestamental period. Yeah. So then we start chapter 24, and what do we see Jesus doing at the beginning of chapter 24?
Leaving the temple and
He leaves the temple, all right, and it says, and these two chapters, they're what are known as the Olivet Discourse, right? Because what Jesus does is he leaves the temple, and as they're leaving the temple, he and the disciples have a discussion about the actual temple, right? So it says, and they were going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple building to him. Now, in one of the other Gospels, it says, and as they were walking, the disciples were talking about and pointing out the stones to Jesus, right? And what you need to remember about this particular temple is that this temple was one of the architectural wonders of the Middle East at that time, right? It wasn't just this little kind of no-account temple. This temple had been being built for decades because it was an ongoing work as a gift to the Jewish people by the Herods, so that the people would accept the Herods as their king, right? And so the temple was a magnificent structure. When you look at pictures of this with Solomon's portico and all of these things, It was an amazing piece of architecture. And that's what they're talking about. Look at these foundation stones. How is this going to be destroyed? How are all of these things going to happen to this magnificent edifice, to this magnificent building? And they walk over to the Mount of Olives, which is symbolic here because it's not the first time that Jesus has been to the Mount of Olives, but it is symbolic in this particular event. Because when you go back into the Old Testament and you look at some of the prophecies about the second coming, it talks a lot about the Messiah being on the Mount of Olives. Yes. Yes. Remember, they're looking here. This is where you see then in Revelation that John the Baptist is standing there and he sees the New Jerusalem and all of. So the Mount of Olives has a place in Jewish apocalyptic literature and in the Old Testament prophecies as this place where you see or watch the judgment of God, right? And so what you have to remember is the things that Jesus talks about to them in these two chapters are things that they're already familiar with because of Old Testament prophecy and because the Essenes had a very robust apocalyptic strain in them. They wrote a lot of apocalyptic literature. They talked a lot about the second coming of the Messiah, or the coming of the Messiah, where we understand to be the second coming. So Jesus and his disciples go out and they're sitting on the Mount of Olives, and what did the disciples ask Jesus? When will these things happen, right? And so what you have to determine here is what are these things, right? And then they have a second question, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So, what is these things when they say, when will these things come? Because Jesus tells them, in verse 2 he says, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. So he tells them about the destruction of the temple. And then they come and they say, okay, when will these things happen? What is these things? The destruction of the temple, right? And then they say, when will the second coming happen? Or what's going to be the sign of the second coming? And when will that happen? So you have these two questions that Jesus is going to answer for them in chapter 24. Now, what I also want you to remember is anywhere in Matthew have we seen that if the disciples come to Jesus with a question that they really want to know the answer to, does Jesus answer the question? Yes. So even though we may not understand exactly everything in chapter 24, they understand it as Jesus is talking to them, right? So what we see is that he starts talking about different time frames and things that are going to happen within these time frames. So he starts answering the question in verse 4. And he answers it with an instruction that is also a warning. So he says in verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. Now, who is the you here? The disciples, right? So what is his first instruction / warning to them?
Pay attention.
Be careful. So what do we know about these things and the times of these things?
They're gonna happen in their lifetime.
Okay, but what is the danger in this time when these things are going to happen? What is the very first thing that he says is the danger during these times?
They could be misled.
They could be misled, right? Now, the question is, how could they be misled? And what he starts doing is he starts laying out all of these different ways that they could be misled. The very first thing he says is, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will do what?
Mislead me.
Mislead. So he says the first thing you need to be careful of, that you're not misled, is about people coming and saying they are me and using my name and my authority. Right? Now, I think this is really interesting because in the first century in Judah, you had a lot of people who claimed to be the Messiah, a lot of people who claimed to be Christ. We still do today. You know, I always think it's interesting when you watch different documentaries about, you know, people, spiritual groups that have gone off the rails and different things, like, say, someone like the Branch Davidians. At some point in time, a news person, a news anchor, was interviewing David Koreshi, and he said to this person, I am Jesus Christ. I am the Messiah. Right? So what we see here is the very first thing Jesus says is be careful, be aware that there are going to be these people who are going to use my name, and with my name comes my what?
Authority.
My authority. Right? So be careful of people who do that. What is the second thing that he says that they need to be careful of in verse 6? You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not what? Frightened. Right? Now, I thought this was interesting because yesterday, as I'm looking at the news, pops this little thing about all this conflict between Pakistan and India. And I'm like, now that could turn into a huge problem with two countries that have no direct communication between their leadership, and they both have the ability to launch nuclear weapons. Okay? So he says, you know what? Be careful. Don't be frightened when you hear these things about wars or rumors of wars. Because he says, for those things must take place, but that is not yet what? The end.
That was pretty compassionate of them to actually use those words, don't be frightened.
Don't be frightened by it. Because what Jesus is doing, he's making a point here about something. He says, during this time of rumors of wars and wars, he says, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. So he says, okay, a nation is going to turn, and you're going to have all this political unrest. But even within those nations, you can have kingdoms, like different areas where different kings rule and things like that. They're going to turn against each other, and you're also going to have all kinds of natural disasters. So not only are you going to have international hostility and war, you're going to have natural disaster. But he says, but guess what? Those aren't signs of the end either.
They're just the beginning.
They're just the beginning of something, right? So basically, what does Jesus want them to understand about the way that the world just functions? It's just the way it is, right? Now, why does he point these out, though? If it's just the way it is, that there are always wars and rumors of wars, and there's always international hostility, and there's always famine, and there's always earthquake, why does he point them out to this to them, and say, but this isn't the end? Why does he say that? Okay, they can be misled because what could the false messiahs use?
Those are signs.
These are signs of the end, right? And does this happen today?
Yep.
I mean, every time something happens in the Middle East, what do most Christians do?
Oh, man.
Oh my gosh, it's all over. This is it. Where does this fit in, right? And if I'm really paying attention, how should I respond to those things?
Those are just the beginning of birth pains.
They're just the beginning of things, okay? So Jesus is saying, be careful because the false teachers, the false prophets, the false messiahs are going to try to use these things to lead you astray. And to frighten you, right? But he says, but these are just the beginning of the birth pangs. And what's interesting is that phrase, using birth pangs, it was a Jewish metaphor, and it was a common metaphor to talk about the beginning and then basically an intermittent time before the end comes, right? Now, the thing about birth pangs is sometimes they end in a child being produced, but sometimes they don't. Right? Sometimes it can be false labor, sometimes it's real labor, and even if it's real labor, from the time of the first true contraction until a child is delivered, could be hours or sometimes days. Right? So what you see here is that Jesus starts talking about then this time frame that will be, but these things of wars and rumors of wars and famine and natural disaster and all of these kind of things are part of it, but they're not the actual time before the second or before the coming. Okay? So he says this is just kind of, these are the things that are going to happen, but that's not the sign. That's not what you need to pay attention to. Now, what does he say those going to be part of this time as well?
Tribulation,
In the next
death,
verse.
hatred.
Yes. He says, then they will deliver who?
The followers.
You, and the followers here are who? The disciples, right? He says, then they will deliver you to tribulation. Now, the word tribulation just means a pressing in on, right? It means to pressure something. It means to cause affliction in some way, right? So is this the first time that he's told them that once he leaves that they're going to be afflicted or have pressure put on them or anything like that? Nope. Remember chapter 10, right? And even in the Beatitudes, remember at the end of the Beatitudes, he says, blessed are those who for my sake are persecuted for the kingdom, right? So from the very beginning of his ministry, there's been this element of understanding that true disciples will be persecuted, right? So he goes on and he says, then they will deliver you to tribulation, and that pressure and that affliction could lead to what? Your death, and you'll be hated by who?
All nations.
All nations. Why?
Because of his name.
Because of my name. Now, what does his name represent?
Authority.
Authority and the gospel message, right? The gospel is preached in whose name? In Jesus' name, right? So he makes it very clear that these afflictions now that they're going to suffer personally are going to be connected to the gospel. So they have all of these things that are going to be happening outwardly to them by the nations, by the people that they're going to share the gospel with. All of these things are an outward tribulation, an outward persecution. But then he goes on in verse 10 and he says what's going to happen inwardly to the kingdom. Yeah, he says at that time many will fall away because of what? Because of the persecution. Right? He says many will fall away, and not only will many fall away, but they will also do what? Betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will do what? Mislead. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will do what? Grow cold. Right? So is it a very happy picture that Jesus is painting for them about the time of these things? No. Outward pressure on the gospel, inward persecution by people who say they're part of the kingdom, but they are not part of the kingdom, right? And Jesus even says that the reason that these things will happen is because one of the commandments which they are told to follow will no longer be followed, which is to love one another, right? So he gives him this picture, but he says that during this time, in verse 13, he says, but what? The one who endures to the end will be saved. Right? So, what does it mean to endure something? Yeah, you just continue on in it, right? And this is what you saw when you looked at Ephesians and in Hebrews. It talks about that we endure these things that happen to us because Christ endured these things for us. One of the things that we have to remember is that in Scripture, and we're going to see this in Hebrews next year when we study it, is that endurance is the demonstration of faith. okay? And you see that from Genesis to Revelation. Those who endure, who stand in the promises of God, who believe in the promises of God, who cannot be swayed from those promises of God, they endure everything. And that enduring becomes the demonstration of their faith, right? So if these people are falling away, and if they're betraying one another, if they're not acting in love, if they're not doing all of these things, and say that they're part of the kingdom, what are they not doing though? They're not enduring.
But and that's discussion item right there, because it looks like he is speaking of, you know, he says at that time in verse 10, at that time many will fall away and betray one another, hate one another. And in the context of that, I mean, the previous sentence was talking about his disciples, his followers, us, you know, all these years later.
Well, now he's not talking about all these years later. Now this is one of the things that you have to remember about this chapter. The disciples have come to him with some specific questions because of a statement that he has made about a time frame when he is placing judgment on Jerusalem and the temple. He says that this judgment that they're going to endure, because they're going to have the entire judgment of all that blood of the prophets from Abel until now placed upon them, because they will not repent, all of these things. And he says all these things will happen when? In this generation.
Yeah, okay. We'll carry on, because I got questions and I've written them down here. We'll get to it.
Okay. Now see, this is what you have to be careful about, because so many times people come to this passage with what they think the passage is saying because of how it fits into other end-time prophecy. But Jesus is talking to them right here, answering their question.
About that time.
About this time. Now he's going to go on, because it's not just about this time only. Their question is, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming? They're two separate questions, right? And they're two separate questions involving two separate time frames or two separate events, right? So this is why it's important to figure out, what are these things that they're talking about?
All right, well, so when we go back and even starting in verse 4, and Jesus says, you know, you're going to be careful not to be misled, and then people are going to come and they're going to say he's the Christ, and then they're going to hear wars and rumors of war. Are you saying, or because I don't, you're going to have to walk me through this, because that to me looks like he's talking about something that's futuristic,
Okay.
like hasn't happened yet.
Okay, all right, so wait, now, but what you have to keep in mind is that the context of this conversation is the judgment that he has just proclaimed on Jerusalem and upon this generation. And then he tells them that the temple's going to be destroyed, that there won't be one stone left on top of another, which means that the temple is destroyed. What is Jesus saying about their religion? Yeah, it's going to be disrupted. They're not going to be able to bring their sacrifices. They're not going to be able to do any kind of sin offerings. They're not, basically, if the temple is destroyed, the Jews have no way of approaching God any longer. This is a serious thing when Jesus said that this temple's going to be destroyed, right? And so this is the question then, well, when will these things happen?
I thought they were talking about his temple was going to be destroyed and raised 3 days later.
Okay, but Matthew hasn't really said that much about that. Now, John talks about that, but Matthew hasn't, that's not something that Matthew has talked about a lot.
That makes sense.
See, so when Jesus, he tells them this, then their question is, okay, when are these things going to happen? The judgment on Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple.
Just a few years.
See, this is when will it happen? And then Jesus will come in and he will start talking about the sign of his coming, right? But what is interesting about this is he says, but what, listen to what I'm telling you, he says. You're going to see, people are going to come after I'm back with the Father. They're going to come claiming to be me. They're going to use my name. They're going to usurp my authority. But I'm telling you, remember, it's not me. And in this time frame, the world is just going to go on the way that it has always gone on, but you're going to have a little different context of which you look at the world now. So you're going to look at wars and rumors of wars and famine and natural disasters, international hostility. You're going to look at it through a different lens because you're going to look at it, if you're not careful, always thinking, oh, is this the time that he's going to return? And you're going to have false prophets and false Christs who are going to use that against you and make you be fearful and make you be uncertain. But what I'm telling you is that that's just the way the world is. Right? It's not changing. It's just the way the world is. But then you're going to be out in the world. I'm going to send you out in the world, and how are you going to be received in the world? You're going to be persecuted, right? And then, not only are you going to be persecuted, but because of the kingdom, and this is what we already know about the composition of the kingdom, that not everybody who says that they're part of the kingdom is actually part of the kingdom, right? He says, so when these persecutions come, not only are you going to have these persecutions from outside, you're going to have these internal things within the kingdom that are going to start happening. People are going to start falling away because of the persecution. They're going to betray one another to the people who are persecuting them. It says that they're going to, the false prophets will arise that will lead some astray. And the primary commandment that I gave to you to live in, to love one another, is going to be totally disregarded. Right? That's what he's talking about. All of this information is part of these things. Okay? So then he starts in though. So does that make sense, Ken? Ish. Okay. Let's go on and see if it makes more sense. Right? Because then we get to verse 15. Now, but remember, what is the encouragement that he gives to them? Endure. Okay, that's where we were at. Okay, so when he says to endure to the end, what is the end here? Is it the end to the second coming, or is it the end of your life?
End of life.
Okay, so endure to the end of your life, because when you endure and you die, what do you have waiting for you? Salvation, deliverance, rescue is waiting for you. And it goes on and he says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Okay, all right, now this is also how you view this verse. Because what we see here is a really interesting thing. It says it is preached in the world, but Jesus doesn't say to the world.
Yeah, that's what I saw too.
Right? So there's a difference between preaching something in the world and to the world.
And I don't know
To the world means, in a sense, to the entirety of the world. Everybody in the world. In the world conveys more of an understanding of the world known at the time by the people who were there or whatever. Like the Roman Empire, to a Roman, was the known world. Now, because, not just because the Romans were arrogant and self-indulgent, but because the Roman Empire stretched all the way from Britain into Africa, all the way across the Middle East, into Turkey, up into this area of Southern Europe, the Roman Empire was vast, right? And so when you're talking about this, it's this idea that it's preached in the world at that time, to all of it, right? Now, some people have taken this verse because when it comes to the second coming, we like to create checklists. And we like to create checklists because we think, oh, as long as this hasn't happened, then I don't have to worry about Christ returning, right? So people have interpreted this verse that until the last tribe of wherever in the world, in deepest, darkest Indonesia, or someplace like that, until that last person hears the gospel message, Christ can't return. And that's not what Jesus is saying. What he's saying is that this gospel message that you have, that you're going to take into the world, is going to have a profound impact. Even though there's going to be persecution against it, it's actually going to be accepted within the world. And that acceptance will set the stage then for Jesus' second coming. It's not talking about that every single continent, every single person has to hear that. Now, if you find that in another part of the text, then we can apply it that way in that part of the text, but that's not what Jesus is talking about here.
I'm not sure I followed what you just said in that last 2 minutes, because this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world
Right,
as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come.
right.
Preached in the whole world, and I saw that same thing in verses 2.
Mhm.
There is a difference.
There is a difference.
Go through that again succinctly, because I'm not sure I really get that.
Okay, so, all right. Now remember, whenever you're reading something like this and interpreting it, you have to hear it with the original audience's ears, right? To the original audience of the disciples, and at that time, what was the known world?
The Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire. And because it expanded the world in a sense. It wasn't like the Roman Empire was this little tiny thing just at the bottom of Rome. I mean, of Italy. It reached up into the north, like into like northern Scotland. I mean, you have like, when you go to northern Wales, which is the very tip of the British Isles, you see evidence of Roman troops there. You have Saguntium, that is still the archaeological remains of a Roman barracks. I mean, you have it, so you have that right there all the way up into the North Sea, then all the way over into Germany, into France, into Spain, into all the way over to the steppes, all right, to the Asian steppes. The Romans were all the way over there. Then you come down, they're all the way into what we know now as Turkey, all of that kind of thing, then over into the Middle East. And then you come down, and then you have Africa. It was vast. And so this is, to them, the known world was the Roman Empire. Right?
I mean, not to pick it too hard, but it says preached in the whole world, not the known world.
Okay, but to them, that was the whole world. That was the audience. To that audience, that was the whole world.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a game changer, really. I mean, when you look at the big picture, my understanding, and I'm not trying to bring any baggage into this conversation, but my understanding is that Christ will not come back until the world has heard his message. Now, that doesn't mean every individual one, but it means that there's an ability for anyone to hear, and we know that from Romans, that anyone can.
Okay, well, but this is what I think, this is where I think it's interesting, because hold that thought. Because I think you're really correct. I think that what we do is that we miss what Jesus is the point he's trying to get across to them in Matthew 24. Because we think, oh no, there are this whole other group of stipulations on this second coming that have to be met before Jesus can ever come. And should we really think about it that way? See, that's the question.
Well, if we did, then it would totally mess up the whole 10 virgin deal and all that stuff where you just never know. Because if we're waiting
Okay, don't go there yet. Right? Okay, because what you're doing, see, this is because Jesus is telling them a certain list of information that is important for them. And so what you see here is he tells them that there's going to be persecution outside, there's going to be persecution within, but what are the true believers going to do? What are the true kingdom dwellers going to do? They're going to endure. They're going to endure even in the midst of that persecution to the end of their life, and then what they get is that they're rescued, In a sense, they have salvation, but while they're here, what is their responsibility? Endure and preach the gospel, right? Preach the gospel everywhere they go, right? And that's what he's talking about. That until he comes, this is our purpose. This was their purpose. Until he comes was to preach the gospel. Then he starts in verse 15. Therefore, right? When you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in the house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babes in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation which has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, remember what he told them what's going to happen at the end of chapter 23. What's going to happen to the temple? It's going to be destroyed. They carry on this discussion here. Then he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. What is the holy place?
The temple.
The temple. He says, let the reader understand. He says, when you see that, then what do they need to do? Run. Fast. Yes.
So this is obviously before the temple's torn down.
Yes.
Okay, so
Okay.
that place is there by the time we know, maybe 70.
Correct. Right? Now see, what's really interesting about this is that there are people who say, oh no, what Jesus is talking about, because this phrase, abomination of desolation, is used in Daniel, it's used here, but it's also used in 2 Thessalonians. Now, what's interesting about it is that when Daniel uses it, it came to be understood that the abomination of desolation came about during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So when Jesus mentions this prophecy in Daniel, they're thinking, well, that's already happened. So what we see here is that there are certain prophecies that can have multiple applications.
So with that being, we're gonna have to work through this because
Okay, well, if you give me a chance, we will. Okay?
But
So-
all right. Well, let me just ask you then, before you work through it further, are you going to discuss the possibility this might be a future event?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. See, when Jesus says this to them, and he even points out, this prophecy comes from Daniel, right? What do they already know about that time frame that had happened during Daniel?
That's the end of times.
This has already happened. This has already happened. This happened during Antiochus when he tried to force Rome or Greek culture and all of that kind of thing on the Jews. He came down, he desecrated the temple, he slaughtered a pig on the altar. For years, this temple was left desecrated. They couldn't worship, they couldn't do anything until the Great Maccabean Revolt, where then they cleansed the temple and they had the oil that supposedly lasted for the 8 days, so then that was the creation of Hanukkah. They're thinking, when they did, in their minds, this already happened during the intertestamental period. This already happened during Antiochus Epiphany. But Jesus says it's gonna what? It's gonna happen again, right? And Paul will use this same passage to talk about a future event that will happen when some person stands in the temple and is described as the man of lawlessness, and he will bring destruction and sacrilege upon the temple. This is what I'm saying. This phrase right here, when you run it through scripture, is used different times in different time frames to explain something that's going to happen at one place.
Is this during Daniel's dreams that you're talking about, that the future
future to Daniel, but it's already happened.
Yes, it was future to Daniel, but it happened.
We have two dreams. The first one is the future of his future.
Right, but what Jesus is pointing out to them is that this is a fulfillment of that prophecy that Daniel had. You thought it was already fulfilled, but I'm telling you, it's going to be fulfilled again. Part 2. And from the 2 Thessalonian letter, Paul implies that there will be a part 3 to it. Right?
Yes.
Okay, see, this is what I'm talking about, just thinking, locking in something into one context.
No, and I understand
Yeah.
what I mean, but I mean, clearly, he has to be talking future here, because he says whoever is on the
Okay.
housetop, not whoever was on
Future,
the housetop.
future to who?
To Jesus'
To
life.
the people he's talking
To the people he's talking to, right? So he's talking about, okay, when you see this, and how he describes it is like the abomination that Daniel talks about. And what's really interesting about this is that the way he leaves it, he says it's going to be something that desecrates or causes horrors because it's in the temple, right? But what's interesting is that he leaves it kind of open to interpretation, and basically he says to them, you'll know it when you see it. Because he says, let the reader understand, right? So he doesn't describe exactly what the abomination is going to be, but when they see it, they're going to know that it's an abomination and it's a fulfillment of this particular passage in Daniel. He says, when you see that, this generation, when you see that, what do?
Run.
Run. Right? Run. And then he describes what it's going to be like, right? He says that just leave what you're doing. See, this is what's so interesting about it, is that Jesus doesn't dwell on what the abomination is going to be. What he does is what they should do when they see the abomination. So he says, run to the mountains, do all of this kind of thing. He says, woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babes in those days. Because if you have a child with you, it's going to be much harder to escape. It's going to be much harder to care for your child. If the Romans caught you with a child, depending on the age of the child, if it was a babe in arms, they were usually slaughtered and the women were taken into captivity to be slaves. If they were toddlers, they took the toddlers and they made them slaves. So this idea, this is going to be a harsh time, and he says, and pray that it doesn't happen in winter, because it's hard to travel in winter, but he also says pray that it doesn't happen on the Sabbath, because if it happens on the Sabbath, you're not going to have people who are going to be willing to help you escape, right? And so this is what's so interesting. Now, this was fulfilled with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD.
Well, can I ask another question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Irene, I don't mean to be dragging this thing
No,
down.
that's what we're here for, because this is a passage.
When the abomination of desolation happened, I mean, clearly, something happened in AD 70 and something prior to that with Daniel's thing. So, and then I think also this is speaking of the future, but it says when you see that, then if you're in Judea, you flee to the mountains and then, just get the heck out of there. I don't understand why they're getting the heck out of there. Why? Is there about to be like a war? Are some aliens coming down and gonna nuke the place? What's going on?
The understanding then
That's
is in
Nephilim.
verse 21.
Nephilim were coming.
In verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation. This is another one of those phrases that we think that we understand what it means every time it's used.
All right, keep that. But, verse 20, but pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath.
Right?
Okay, he is talking to his followers.
Right?
He, Jesus, fulfills the prophecy, and the Sabbath fulfills the Old Testament laws.
Okay, but that doesn't have any bearing on what he's talking about here.
Well, but work it with me then, because I see or on a Sabbath, and I'm like, why this reference? Jesus did away with the Sabbath.
Because
why is this?
Okay, but not to the Jews.
But,
What are the Sabbath laws that are still in play here.
At this time.
At this time, you cannot open a business, you can't walk any distance, you can't carry anything, you can't do anything like that. If this destruction comes on a Sabbath,
No one's gonna help.
nobody's gonna help them, nobody's gonna do anything. They're gonna have this conflict of violating all of these Sabbath laws, trying to escape. It's gonna be horrible if they have to do this on a Sabbath because of what the Sabbath represents to them as Jews. Because there's not gonna be anything open to get supplies, people aren't gonna help them. The gates of the city may not even be opened, or at least all the gates of the city may not even be open for them to escape. The Sabbath would be the worst time for there to be some kind of any military conflict. And then what Jesus does is he describes the conflict then in the next verse.
So, maybe this is, if I'm dragging this out too far, then just tell me, we'll talk about it later, but this is a serious thing for me, because if, all right, so we know, because he's been talking to Pharisees through the whole book and the other books, and he's always like, you're gonna heal on the Sabbath, you do what you need to do on the Sabbath, but now he's saying, what if this bad thing happens on the Sabbath, you can't do
But
anything?
you're comparing apples and oranges.
Maybe.
Okay, he's already told them, okay, what it is, but what you see here is that he's told them that he's Lord of the Sabbath, he can do all that, spiritually he is. But in Jerusalem, physically,
Okay.
what
all
is
right.
the condition of the people and how do they see the Sabbath in the physical Jerusalem that they will be in?
They're still
On
Jews,
there.
they still honor the old.
Honor all of the things
Just
that
the
God.
people though that he's, I mean, this is, we're talking culturally, not to his specific
Correct.
followers. Now, okay,
He's
I
not
get
talking
that.
about a spiritual fulfillment of the Sabbath here or anything. He's just talking about the hardship that if you have to run on a Sabbath, how difficult it's going to be because of the cultural constraints about the Sabbath.
So just to clarify, so I'm absolutely sure of this, in the 80s when we moved to Utah, everything in Utah was closed on Sunday, and if that had happened to Christians, we would have had no place to go because everything is shut down.
Correct.
But we still had the freedom because we're
Yes,
kids.
yes.
Context good.
Yes.
Move on, sorry.
Yes. See, what you were doing is you were comparing spiritual to physical.
Okay, I got it.
And you can't do that here because Jesus is purely talking about a physical event that's going to happen in Judea the event will be signaled by something they see happening in the temple. And when that happens, they need to leave. They need to leave as quickly and pray that it doesn't happen on a Sabbath, because if it happens on the Sabbath, your resources for what you're gonna
Gotcha.
need to flee
Yeah, all right,
are
good.
gonna be limited.
Okay.
And then he goes on in verse 21 and he says, for then there will be a great tribulation. Now, remember, tribulation just means a pressure, a squeezing, all of that kind of thing. The word great here means larger than before, right? So now he's talking about this great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Then he goes on and he says, unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, this also has to be taken into context, because when the Romans came to Jerusalem in 68 and then destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, they were bound and determined to use Judah and Jerusalem as an example for any of the provinces that would rebel. They had been dealing with these Jewish rebellions for decades. They were tired of them. They were tired of the Zealots. They were tired of all of them. They made Jerusalem and Judea an example of horror, right? And what Jesus is talking about here in this idea that there was such a great tribulation that has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will, he's not talking about necessarily something like the Holocaust or something like that, because people read this and they go, well, that can't be true. What about the Holocaust? What about this? But what he's talking about is in comparison to the population that was killed. In Jerusalem, you had almost the entire population of Jerusalem killed, right? So what he's talking about is in comparison to the number of people that survived, it was the greatest horror that it has ever happened, right? So think of it this way. If something happened in Salt Lake and 95% of the people along the Wasatch Front died. We would say that was a great war. But somebody in New York might say, well, it's not that great because we had something happen in New York and only 35% of the population died. 35% of the population of New York is more than X number of people along the Wasatch Front. So how are you saying that that's such a great horror? It's because of the scope of the number of people there. See, you're talking about almost the complete annihilation of a people group in Jerusalem. And that's what Jesus is talking about. That there had never been the wrath of Rome poured out on a specific group of people like what they poured out on the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem. And what happened during that siege makes what happened to Jerusalem and Judea during the time of Jeremiah seem like a walk in the park. You had the extensive cannibalism of the children. You had all of these kind of things that were happening there. And what's really interesting about it is that Josephus records all of this in his understanding of what happened to Jerusalem. So then Jesus says, okay, this great horror is going to happen to Jerusalem. And if God had not have stopped it in some way, the only reason he stopped the judgment on Jerusalem and Judea was because of the who? The elect. Right? Now, this goes back to the understanding of Great Tribulation. When you look at this, what you see is that when you look at Revelation, there is a tribulation, then there's a Great Tribulation. But what you see is that when Jesus is talking about this Great Tribulation, it's the forerunner, in a sense, to the Great Tribulation. But this is still considered a Great Tribulation because of what happened. But it's not what a lot of times people interpret as the Great Tribulation. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, Chris.
When you mentioned the Holocaust, I thought, we're gearing up to something else now, and people are just ignoring it like it's no big deal.
Right. And this is what, during this time, okay, so now remember, these are still these times, right? So these times include all of those normal things that go on, the persecution of the church, the persecution in the church, then the fall of Rome, or the fall of Jerusalem, the occupation of Judea, and then Jesus goes on and he says, then, during that time frame, right? So starting at about, from the time that he ascends, going on forward in these times, he says, then, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe them. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders. Why? So as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Now, do you see what they're going to mislead? They're going to try to mislead the elect by? Signs and wonders.
Yeah, no, that's a sit up and pay attention verse right
Now remember, what did he say about all these wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, all of these things that can be interpreted as signs? What did he say to do with those? They're just natural things. Don't pay attention to them. Don't be frightened and be misled in any way that you fall under this teaching of these false prophets. And he goes on and he says, behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner room, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather.
That threw me for a loop until I really thought about it. Now, if there's any doubt, then he's not returned.
Yeah, there's no way to miss it.
There's
See,
no way to miss it.
Because this is what he's saying. If people are telling you, because how might these false prophets and false teachers mislead them? By saying what?
Christ is returned.
He's returned, but he's over here. You have to go to, he's hidden in India. You have to go over there and see him. Or he's in this particular place and nobody can see him but a select few. What does Jesus say?
No,
That's not the way it's going to happen. He basically says that his actual second return will be unmistakable in its nature, universal in its visibility, cosmic in its scope and effect.
I couldn't figure out the part about the vultures, and then I finally
Okay.
found something that talked about you can't hide a fallen body in the wilderness because
Right.
the vultures circle around it.
They're drawn
And it's
to
gonna
it.
be very obvious that Jesus
Yes.
returned to make it clear to everyone that he's back.
Right, because even though you may not know a body is there, if there's a body somewhere in the desert or somewhere like that,
The
and
vultures
the
are
vultures are
circling.
circling,
Yeah,
and this is, they're compelled to come wherever the carrion is.
and even the lightning thing that it talks
Yeah.
about in the verse before that, I mean, it's
And
gonna be
so,
obvious.
yeah, so Jesus is saying that it's not gonna be, and people are gonna be drawn to him when he comes. Right? Now, what are going to be the cosmic effect of that coming, and how is it gonna be unmissable besides the lightning and everything? He says,
The
but
trumpet.
immediately after the tribulation of those days. Right now, one of the things we have to remember, we just found out what are those days. From the time he ascends onward, right?
The
right?
times that we're in.
The times even that we're in now, right? But he says, so these things, so at some point in time, at the end of those days, then he's going to actually return, right? Now, their other question was, what is the sign of your return? Right, and he says, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches are already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place.
Okay, so this generation right there is the question. Now, there was a footnote on one that said this race.
Okay, well, this people. Now, first of all, what we see here is that what is the sign of the Son of Man? In Matthew,
Coming on the clouds with power and great glory.
okay, but has Jesus not already told the Pharisees, what is the sign of the Son of Man?
Rising in the third day.
The resurrection. So what we see here is that when you see the resurrected Christ in the sky, and he is coming back, what you know is that the end of the days are here. Right? He has returned. Upon his return, he will send forth his angels to gather his people to himself. Now, these passages, when you look at Isaiah and Ezekiel, this gathering of the people to himself in those passages are the believing Israelites who are still here. Right? So he gathers these people, and then he says, learn from this parable. And he says at the end of the parable, truly I say, he says, so when you see all these things, right, recognize that he is here. What are these things? Or that not that he's here, that he's near. Now this is where it's really interesting, because these things,
Well, what verse are you in now?
in verse 33, so you too, when you see all these things, and we just defined all these things as all those tribulations from
verses 5
verse
through 28. I
4
had that
through
same question.
28,
What are these things verses 5 through 28 tell us?
5 through 28.
Yeah.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. Recognize that he is near, right near the door. So basically, what Jesus is telling them is that the persecution of the church outwardly, persecution of the church inwardly, the spread of the gospel message in the world, the fall of Jerusalem, and the scattering of Jerusalem, everything that happened, that's all that needs to happen for him to return.
So really, the fall of Jerusalem is the only thing that's left.
No, Jerusalem already fell.
70 AD.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it could happen any second.
Any second.
Wow, that's kind of horrifying. Not horrifying, it's awesome for us, but it's kind of horrifying.
It's
for us that
sobering,
don't know.
right?
For the rest
See, this is what I think is so interesting, because what do we like to do? We like to go, oh, no. It says in Daniel this, it says in Revelation that, it says all this kind of thing. And yes, all of those things are true. But see, this is what's interesting about kind of the crux of it here. Jesus says, yes, there is going to be another temple rebuilt. There is, but you know what? Nobody knows when I'm going to return. Not even I in the incarnation know when I'm going to return. Only the Father does. What I'm telling you is that this is all that really has to happen before I can return.
So, and again, don't let me, this might be something you and I can talk about at coffee, but, I was looking at this too, you know, and I'm always the guy that's like, oh, he's coming, he's any second now, there's UFOs, there's aliens, there's earthquakes, there's famine, I'm all about it, he's gonna be here any second now. But here's the reality,
None
right?
of those signs, though, should be what you're paying attention to.
But what I see here, I mean, I made a whole list here, you know, the wars and rumors and the nations and the famines and,
Right.
and all that stuff's going on. But the only thing, and if you look at it chronologically as I see it here, where it talks about here, it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be, that's after he comes back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, this is what I'm talking about. You have two different questions. What are these things, and what's the sign of the you're here?
The
Okay?
year here could happen any second, then the sun will get dark. And the moon
Yes.
will give up its light,
See,
and the
this
stars
is
will
what he's
fall from the
saying.
sky.
Me coming can happen as soon as that temple in Jerusalem fell and Judah was devastated, the stage was set. Jesus says right here, at that moment, he could return at any time. But the sign of his return, that he's here, will be
Evidence
to
everybody.
see him come in the clouds with his angels, and then you know what? Everything's a done deal at that point in time. And this is why he goes on and he talks about the time of Noah, right? Because then he goes down and he says in verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. Now what he's talking about is in his incarnation, he did not know that time, right? Because there were some limitations. He says, for the coming of man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, married and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure, if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to have been broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Now, what is the point of bringing in the Noah situation?
Because the world was going on the whole 120 years he's building the ark until all of a sudden it's too late.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole point, and so many people will look at this passage so many times and they'll say, oh, this is a passage about the rapture. It's not a passage about the rapture. It's a passage about the normalcy of life. That everybody's just doing what is normal in life. They're marrying, getting married, they're fixing dinner at night, they're waking up, going to work, going to breakfast. That's what they were doing until one day Noah went in that ark and God closed the door, and then what happened? It was too late.
Yeah.
They understood the judgment that they were under. But until that time, life was just going on as normal. Okay, now, I think this is really interesting because so many times we read the book of Revelation, and you guys remember when we studied Revelation, there are all these horrendous things that happen. But here I'm wondering, okay, do all of those horrendous things that happen in Revelation, do they become normal? do they become the normalcy of life?
For the unsaved,
Or for even the church?
yes.
Well, all right, so
See, this is what Jesus is trying to get them to understand. Be ready, because he's coming in the normalcy of life. There's not going to be a whole bunch of signs that are pointing to it.
Right.
Because he's already said, don't pay attention to those signs.
that's right.
Just be ready. The only thing that had to happen was the persecution of the church, the spreading of the gospel into the world at that time, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and all that happened there, and then I can come back whenever the Father sends me. Done.
Yeah, I think it's funny. Don't get me wrong. I think that there's a lot of crap going on in the world today. Don't deny that. But we have now had people say that it's the revolution, the time of revelations for Nero and the persecution of the Christians after the fall of Jerusalem. We've had World War I.
Yeah,
We've had World War II.
yeah.
We've had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've had, we can just sit here and just go through history, right?
Right.
So, that's why I don't read Revelations, to be honest with you. Is because at the end of the day, all we need to do is focus on our walk with Christ and how we can do what we need to do.
Those who endure to the end will be saved. See, and I think this is what's so important about this, because people, when they read, and we did Revelation, it was fascinating. But remember, when we finished, we had more questions after we had studied it than we did at the beginning.
Yes.
So it's not like you study Revelation and go, oh, well, we know all of this, okay?
Yeah.
And I think this is what Jesus is meaning. But what I am coming to understand is how something horrendous can become normal. Remember COVID?
Yes.
Remember all the wars that we have now? I mean, nobody even pays any attention to the news coming out of Gaza and Israel anymore, or the Ukraine, or anything like that. It's just, you know what? It's just normal. So this is what I'm starting to ask myself. Are all of those horrendous things that we see and we go, oh my gosh, this is how we would know Jesus is coming, maybe they just become the normalcy of life? So, Chris.
I think also in the church, the fact that so many people believe the flood was mythology or never happened,
Oh yeah, the church
that's
is a mess.
huge. Because it did happen.
It did happen, but see, this is what Jesus is trying to point out. He's not trying to point out, he's not giving them a lesson on the judgment that one will be taken and one will be spared. He doesn't say, because right here he just says that one's taken, one's left. He doesn't say if the one taken is going into the kingdom or is judged, or if the one left is judged or in the kingdom.
That was
Because
one of my
that's
questions.
not
I didn't
the
get that one,
point.
Right,
The point is, be ready.
correct.
But because they weren't ready, when? In the time of Noah. They got carried away with living life, and then when the flood came upon them, it was too late. And then what you see is all of the parables from here on talk about that theme. Right? Honey, yes.
Go ahead, man, I'm bogging this down, let's go.
Well, you can bog for just one more minute if you
Well, I
want
just
to.
have a question that maybe someone else in here has, and maybe they don't, but I think of myself as pretty Bible literate, and then when we start talking about some of this stuff, I find out there's a lot of stuff I really don't know. And so one of the questions I have, and maybe it's very obvious, and maybe this is a debate among the ages, but when we're raptured, is that, so at this
Okay,
point.
we're not gonna go off on that, rapture. Yeah, we're not gonna, because I think that's one of the problems. I think right there, what you are hitting the nail on the head. Because what we have created in our thought process is that whether we admit it or not, we have created a list of things that have to happen before Christ can return. And what Jesus is saying here is, you know what? Everything that needs to happen is already done.
No, I get that, and that
Right.
wasn't my question. What I do have, just a quick, can you lay out chronologically, or maybe you know it and I just missed it somewhere, but I understand that Jesus is coming back, and when he comes back, whenever that is, and we need to be ready now, that's the point, when he comes back, is that at that point, that we are raptured and we're gonna meet him in the clouds, as Paul talks about, or does he come down here first and we know he's the king and he reigns for 1,000 years, and then at the
Okay,
end, that's where I don't
Okay, see,
know.
this is the thing about once you get past what Jesus says right here, right? Once you move past what Jesus says right here, and you get into Revelation, and you get into Daniel, get into 2 Thessalonians, you get into Zechariah, some of those passages, what you see is there become a lot of different interpretations of those.
We don't know
Of,
for sure.
of those things, there are 4 primary interpretations about how long the kingdom is, if the kingdom truly is 1,000 years, if we're already living in the 1,000-year kingdom. Does Jesus come post, mid, pre-trib, past-trib, mid-trib, all of that?
No
kind of
trib.
thing. No trib.
Bingo.
That's what Harley
Oh, wait.
Amanda talks about. Well, but Christians really hope that pre-trib is no trib, kind of thing. But see, this is what I think becomes, in a sense, the problem. Because we get wrapped up in all of those different ideas and those different things. And yes, they're talked about in Scripture. But what we do is we start creating these little lists. Oh, he can't come until this. Oh, he can't come until this. He can't come until there. And what is Jesus saying?
I can come right now.
I come right now.
Jesus says,
Eh?
"Put the problems that you've got today and the problems for tomorrow will take care of themselves."
But what are we supposed to be?
Ready.
Ready. Okay, Don.
I mean, there's a bunch of places where the Israelites or the Hebrew people weren't ready, right?
Yes.
And something to think about, not saying right or wrong, but there's 4 major interpretations and all 4 of those could be wrong,
Yeah, like that.
right?
I just know we're
No.
supposed to be ready for sure.
When we had the prophecies of Jesus Christ, there was 350 some odd prophecies of Jesus Christ? And he fulfilled every single one of them, and they had those for hundreds of years, and they still didn't get it.
Okay, so,
Right.
and I think this is what's so interesting, because Jesus understands that this is a possibility, that we're gonna be misled, we're gonna be distracted, and this is why he repeats 3 times at the end of this chapter, be
ready.
ready. Don't be misled, be ready. And then he starts in chapter 25 with the parables,
And the parables
right?
make the point really
Now,
clearly.
he finishes the parable of chapter 24 with the parable. Now, we're not going to go through every nuance of these parables, right? Because I do want us to finish up chapter 25 tonight. But what you see is that, and we are, we're going to do it. But what I want you to see is that some of the kingdom parables have a recurring theme in them, okay? Now, but let me tell you, when you look at this, the recurring theme, one of the first kingdom parables that Jesus introduced us to was the kingdom is the same as a field that has wheat and tares, right? And the workers say, should we remove the tares from the wheat? And what does the landowner say? No. And he says no, and then Jesus says, I'm the landowner, and he basically says that my angels will come, and they'll be the ones to separate the wheat from the tares, and they'll throw the tares into the eternal fire, right? Then he talks about, in that same chapter, chapter 13, that the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet, catching all of these fish, and the net is pulled upon shore, and the fish are sorted, and then the angels will throw the good fish on this side, and the bad fish are thrown into the fire, right? Then at the end, or in the last chapter, we saw the parable of the kingdom of heaven is like a wedding feast, right? And you have the initial people who are invited to the wedding feast. They don't come, so a second invitation is issued, and those people come to the wedding feast, but there's just one little problem. Who shows up at the wedding feast not willing to abide by the cultural norms and the things of the wedding feast? The guy who doesn't have his wedding clothing on. And what happens to him because he's not appropriately dressed or he's not willing to submit to the guidelines of the kingdom, what happens to him?
Thrown out into outer darkness.
He's thrown out into outer darkness, right? Then we find this parable at the end of 24 about the steward, right? Who, he says, he goes on and he says, He says, who then, in verse 45, is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, right? So another way that this can be translated is, but suppose that servant is wicked, right? That evil slave says in his heart, my master's not coming for a long time, and he begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, and the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour in which he does not know, and what will happen to him? He'll be judged, right? He says he will cut him to pieces and assign him to a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right, so what is he talking now? Remember, the context is this getting ready, right? But what Jesus has also said is that there's a delay between the second coming, what we know as the second coming, and all of these other things that are going on. When Jesus says, and immediately the Son of Man will come, well, immediately has a different understanding for God than it does for us, right?
What verse are you in?
45 of 24, right? So what's the point of this parable in context of what Jesus has just been saying about be ready?
You got problems in your life, you better change it.
Okay, see, this is the whole thing. With the steward, what happens is that the servant, if he's a good steward, he's going to do what the master has told him to, be prepared for the master's return, and so when the master returns, he's not caught off guard, right? He's ready for it. But the wicked servant isn't ready. And this is what you see. He's caught unexpectedly, not living up to the obligation of his master. And because of that, he's thrown out of the master's home. So what is the point that Jesus wants the disciples to understand about this?
You have no idea what this is right now.
Okay, and
Get ready.
get ready. See, get ready, stay ready. And what is our job as those who are conveyors of the gospel message? What are we trying to get others to be ready for? Him, right? Because whoever is not ready when he returns, they're going to be judged, right? So that's what he's conveying with this. Then he moves on, and then he gives us the parable of the 10 virgins. Okay? And he says, and the kingdom of heaven is comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamp. They went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were prudent. For when the foolish took their lamp, they took no oil with them, but the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now, while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep, and at midnight there was a shout, behold, the bridegroom, come out and meet him. Then all the virgins rose and they trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the prudent answered, no, there is not enough for us and you two. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves. And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later, the other virgins also came, saying, Lord, Lord, open up for us. But he answered, truly, truly, I do not know you. Okay, so what do we see here? Who are the 5 foolish and who are the 5 prudent, and why the harsh judgment?
Well, you got some that are ready and some that aren't ready.
Okay, now, but remember,
And Jesus is the bridegroom.
the kingdom of heaven is like this event,
Right.
right? So what you see is that, now remember, in the parable of the tares and the parable of the fish, the dragnet, the kingdom of heaven is the world, right? So what you see here is that you have these virgins who are supposed to be ready for the wedding. What you see is the actions show, though, why they're called foolish is that their actions show that they're not really into the event, right? They don't really care. They don't care that they're supposed to have enough oil. They know what's expected of them because it doesn't say that it's their first wedding that they've been at or anything like that. But what you really see here is their actions show a disregard for the event and a lack of consideration for what was needed in their participation of the event, right? And they sit there until midnight knowing that they don't have what? Enough oil. And then the bridegroom comes, and then what do they ask the others to give them?
Give us some oil.
Give us some oil. But what about the prudent? What have they done? They've prepared for the bridegroom's coming. They've done what they were supposed to do to be part of the event. It shows that they're concerned about the event that they're in. They want to participate in the way that they've been told to participate, in the custom of participation. And when the foolish ask for their oil, what do they say? There's not enough. Right? Now some people look at this and they go, oh my gosh, they're being so mean. Okay, they should have shared with them. But what would have happened if they had shared with them? Nobody would have made it to it, right? And this is the whole point that Jesus is making. Nobody else can prepare you for the kingdom. The coming into the kingdom is your choice, and your living within the kingdom is your choice. So that in the parable, they go off to buy some oil, but then what happens when they come back? The door's shut. And what does the bridegroom say? I don't know you. Right? So what we see here is that those 5 did not have a relationship to the bridegroom. They didn't participate in the ceremony the way that they should have. Were they ready for the coming of the bridegroom? No. Right? So that's with that parable. So little regard for the couple and the event that they don't even prepare for the celebration is the way that many people are about the second coming of Christ. See, this is the problem of making a checklist. Because if you sit there and you go, oh, well, you know what, do they have the red heifers yet there? Oh, gosh, they've got the red heifer. Oh, sure. Well, what about all those utensils they're going to have for the temple? Oh, gosh, they've got all those made? Check. Ooh, oh my gosh. Well, they haven't broken ground for the temple yet. Phew. Okay, I've got time. Right?
It shouldn't even
I've
be
got
like
time.
that. It should just be,
Okay,
Lord, I'm ready.
To do my thing. I'm not saying that it should be that way. I'm just saying that's the way it is.
Oh, I get
See,
that.
people always, when you talk to people, well, you know what, have you ever considered that you should get right with your Creator? Well, you know, I'm young, I've got a lot of time. You know, are you sure? See, this is what Jesus is talking about. Be ready. Because once He comes, the judgment is passed.
That's right.
Right?
That's
You
right.
can't go back and redo it. And that's then when He starts the parable. When He talks about, in verse 12, He says, in verse 13, He says, be on the alert, for you do not know the day nor the hour. Going back to what He had previously talked about. Then He gives them the parable of the servants with the talents. Right? And once again, what do we see? The master of the household, he goes away, but he leaves his servants with these resources, right? He gives to one, he gives 5 talents, and he gives to one 2 talents, and he gives to one 1 talent. And what's really interesting is that Jesus clearly specifies that they're given the talents according to their abilities, right? So it's not like there's this huge expectation that the one who can only manage 1 talent should be managing the 5 talents. Right? They're given according to the expectations. Now, what do the first 2 servants do?
Invest.
They invest, right? And they invest wisely, and they make 100% profit on their investment. But what does the third one do? Nothing. He doesn't do anything with the opportunity. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even put it in the bank. Right? He just, It says that, so then in verse 19, it says that he just dug a hole in the ground in verse 18 and he hid his master's money. Same thing. He doesn't even have enough regard for his master's money to keep it somewhere safe. It's just in a hole in the ground. Right? Then the master returns, right, to settle the accounts. And the one slave comes, And he says, you gave me 5 and now I have 10. And the master says what? Great job, right? Come into my presence with joy, right? Enter the joy, enter into my presence with joy. Servant number 2 comes up.
Same
You
thing.
gave me 2, I've got 4, great. Did a good job. Come into my presence, right? Then number 3. In verse 24 it says, and the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. So see, you have what is yours. Okay? But the master answered and said to him, you wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I could have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For everyone who has, more shall be given, and he who has abundance, but from the one who does not have, even what he does have will be taken away from him. Throw out the worthless slave into outer darkness, and in that place there will be the weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, remember, parables make one point. You may have numerous subpoints, but the purpose of the parable is clear, the finish of the parable is clear, the point is clear. What is this parable about?
Obeying the master.
Obeying the master while he's gone, right? Using what the master gave while you're gone, and this is what's interesting about the kingdom of heaven as it goes through this. The resources here are everyone's ability to understand and come into the kingdom, right? Because it says the kingdom of heaven is like this. Now, what does the one servant do though that has only the 1 talent? Nothing.
He knew how the master earned his money. He could have tried that, or he could
And
have
what's even so
put it away.
interesting about it, and what's so interesting about it is the master doesn't defend himself, but he says, I was so afraid of you, I know that you're a hard man. It's like, really? If you knew I was that hard and that demanding, then surely you would have at least put the money into the bank. So what you see here is that he's not even honest about how the master truly is. He's just looking at how he thinks the master is. But see, it's really interesting because his concept of the master totally is in contradiction with the other 2 servants and their understanding of the master. So what you see here is that he says he's fearful that the master would be angry, but he doesn't do anything to curb the master's anger. So the question is he really angry? The master isn't arguing with the slave in his assessment of himself, but he is arguing about, he does judge him because he didn't do anything with what he had been given. Okay, he calls him lazy. So what's interesting about this particular parable then is what? What's the point that Jesus is making in regard to don't delay, don't do all of those kind of things with the kingdom? What's the point that Jesus is making here?
Prepare, obey.
Do what the master tells you to do, right? The entering into the eternal kingdom is based on living out don't use the opportunity given when the master comes and judges you. You have been given an opportunity to come into the joy of the master. Don't squander the opportunity.
Look after the master's business while he's gone.
Well, see, this is what's so interesting about this, though, because the kingdom, though, is the world. So it's this idea that the master is giving you an opportunity here to do something with his kingdom. Don't squander it, because that's what the servant did.
So does this? If you look at the passage where he talks to his 3 servants, clearly, I mean, if you look at it where the master is Jesus and the servants are his followers, then the 3rd one who didn't do anything was he. See, I might be reading into it too much.
That's the wrong. In this parable, the servants aren't his followers. That's why I pointed you to the previous parables about the tares and the dragnet and the person who came into the banquet See, what Jesus starts talking about at some point in time are these people who are coming into the kingdom, but really have no desire to be part of the kingdom. And with this one, this slave, he doesn't even want to come into the kingdom. He doesn't even want to come into the good joy of his master. Because if he had done anything with the money, it would appear that the master would have welcomed him into his presence with joy if he had done even anything, even just made the interest that he would have gotten in the bank. Because what's interesting about the thing is that there was no expectation of what the master would receive given to the servants.
What's assumed is that all the servants should have had a knowledge of what was expected of them.
Exactly.
One did not perform.
But he had a knowledge.
And he knew.
He knew. But see, this is where you have to be careful, because not all parables have the same assigned meaning to the people in the parable. That's why I pointed out the tares and the wheat are the world. The dragnet is the world. The banquet that the king prepares for his son, it goes to one group, then it goes out to the world, right? This is what we see here. So what we see here is this idea that even in the world, when Christ returns, they are going to be without excuse. No excuse. Because there's enough understanding that has been given to them, as Paul would say, just through creation and all kinds of things, that they should come to an understanding. And so this is what he's saying, right? So he says, be aware, right? Be vigilant, be all of these things. Now, what's interesting about this is that you have all of these parables that basically have the same theme. Delay, return, what happens when the master returns, okay? Some come into joy, some go to punishment. Then, you have this interesting little thing that Jesus talks about in verse 31. He says, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Right? Now that goes along with parables that we've seen. He says, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Okay?
So he's talking to nations, though. It's
Okay.
nations.
Right. But this is interesting because Jesus goes back to that question about what's going to happen when you return. Right? He'd already mentioned that, gathering his people from the four winds and all of that. And this goes along because what was the end result of all the parables? When the master returned, what happened? Judgment. Whether for good or for bad. Right? Just judgment. What's interesting though, did you notice this, that in this, Jesus says that this event is going to happen, and then he flips it into parable style again. Did you notice that? Because he doesn't say that I will say to those on my right hand. He says the king says to those on his right hand. Now, the understanding, though, is because he says that he's come in all of his glory with all of his angels, and he's sitting on his glorious throne.
That is
So
Jesus.
the king in the parable is Jesus.
Right.
But what's the purpose of this discussion about the king and the sheep and the goats?
Well, I don't know, because if you look at verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, but that is, if you follow the context, then the king will say to those nations on his right.
Okay,
He's not talking to individuals.
okay, so this is what's interesting about this, all right? When he says nations in 32, the way that that's constructed in the Greek is nations as in people groups. And usually, when the word nations is used in the gospel, it is in reference to the Gentile nations, right? Not the nation of Israel, right? So when he says, and all the nations will be gathered before him, now, this is where, and let me just preface this is where your understanding of what Jesus is saying here can somewhat be clouded because of what we see as far as the rapture, as far as those kind of things. Because what is not mentioned here is God's people, anything like that, the kingdom, nothing like that. It just says the nations, right? So it almost appears that the assumption is here that this is at the second coming. This judgment does not include the church or the kingdom in a sense, like we understand the kingdom, but it does include some people who have done some good things, right? So let's just stop there for a second. But before we go any further, what has Jesus said is very clear about how you get into the kingdom. By him, right? You cannot come into the kingdom purely by works. Because if you could come in purely by works, then who would be welcomed into the kingdom?
Everybody.
All these Pharisees, all these people. If it was just based upon outward works, then the kingdom would be theirs. But this is what Jesus has said. Nobody can get in through works. You have to come in through me, right? Because this becomes a kind of an interesting point of what this little parable talks about. Because Jesus says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And he goes on, and now what becomes the basis of their inheriting? You fed me when I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. Sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. What are all those things?
Good things.
But they're all works. Right? So this is interesting. Because if we interpreted that these are, in a sense, what saved you to get into the kingdom, then we have a real problem with this little parable, right? But they seem surprised that Jesus is telling them these things. Because they're like, wait a second. Okay, they don't seem surprised that this is kind of a discussion about the kingdom, of who gets to go into the kingdom, but they do seem surprised when Jesus lists these things, because they're like, when did we ever see you in any of these states? Right? And then what does Jesus say? And the king answered and said to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even to the least of them, you did it to me. Now, the question is, who are these brothers of his? Okay, now, let me give you three interpretations of this passage, right? The first one is that Jesus is allowing these sheep to come into the kingdom purely based on their acts of charity. That's it. They're living according to the great religion's understandings of almsgiving, helping the poor, helping the sick, helping the needy. And those acts of charity become the reason that they get into the kingdom, because Jesus identifies with all of humanity as his brothers. Now, is that a biblical interpretation of salvation and how you get into the kingdom?
No,
Okay.
no.
Okay,
Can't be.
so it can be, right? The second popular interpretation is that Jesus is telling those who go into the kingdom that the brother that they have held, these brothers of mine, his connection, that these are the apostles and missionaries and people like that who have taken the gospel out into the world. And if you are kind to them and help them and feed them and do all of that kind of thing, then those acts of charity are what puts you into the kingdom here.
Nope, that can't be either.
Why?
It can't be because it's still, that's still works-based.
Not biblical.
It's
Okay, but they're missionaries who are doing the work of the kingdom.
right, but for people that are nice to missionaries, that doesn't give them entrance to heaven.
Okay. The third interpretation.
Which has to be the correct one.
Okay.
Where Jesus
Well,
says, who are my brothers
but I'll
and
tell
sisters?
you,
And he
okay,
says,
no. What I'll tell you is that the second and the third, because some people point back to that, but it does kind of have it has a similarity to the third. What the third interpretation is here is that this is at the end time when Jesus has gathered the nation of Israel back to him. All of those saved believers who survive everything, they recognize that Christ has come, they recognize him as their Messiah, and they say, Hosanna, great is he who comes in the name of the Lord, right? And what this judgment of the nations is about here is how the nations treated the people of Israel during the time of those last days. Now, what's interesting about, though, it says that he gathers the nations before him and he separates them from one another. He doesn't separate the nations from one another. The way this is constructed in the Greek is he separates the people out of those nations from one another. So out of the nation, say, of Uganda, he would look at that nation of Uganda and he would say, goat, 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 sheep, 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 goat, 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 right? But for it to fit into the context of what Jesus is talking about here, all of the people at that time would have to think that they were part of the kingdom. Okay? So all of those nations, in a sense, that he's brought to them. Now this would go back into an understanding that at this point in time, all of the hostile nations have been judged. They've been destroyed. The church is reigning with him, and then what you see are these people who are left on the earth, who are brought before God, who have survived this whole thing, and they think they're going to go into the kingdom of God, right? And then when Jesus says, okay, you go over here, you go over here, they don't really understand the separating, but then Jesus says, okay, all of you over here, you go into the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundations of the earth. Now, with that statement, though, comes with the understanding that they have done what was needed to come into that kingdom prior to this point. Okay? Then what you see is that he says that their willingness, that they're coming into the kingdom, is based upon their love for their neighbor and their brothers, right? And he ties this to a connection to himself. My brethren, what you ever do for the least of these, you do for me, right? And then he turns to the goats, and what does he say to the goats? Depart from me, right? He says, and they say, then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels, right? Now, see, this works if you're looking at it through the lens of the other parables, because what you see is that all of these people at the end of this time frame, when Jesus comes back, they've survived all of these things, and what would their assumption be? I'm in. We survived. We're going to make it into this kingdom. We're part of this kingdom that survives. And then you have this last sorting that he talks about, like with the tares and the wheat, with the dragnet, all of that kind of thing, where his angels come, they sort, and that's when the final decision is determined, right? But what's interesting about this parable that he says is that what it implies, in a sense, is that entering into the kingdom is based on living out the principles of the kingdom, because those are the king's principles. And this is what Jesus is trying to get them to understand. And I really do think this is why he flips the language into a parable, because he's been giving them all of these kingdom parables, and then this is the last kingdom parable that they will get in this Olivet discourse. Now, you can disagree, because I will tell you, of all the parables, in a sense, that Jesus ever gave, this one has the most discussion surrounding it, right? Because there does seem to be a little ambiguity about how are these other, but in the interpretation of it, what we have to remember is you do not get into the kingdom, truly get into the kingdom, based on works. But once you are in the kingdom, is there an expectation that you will live as I'm a citizen of the kingdom in regards to the kingdom and what the kingdom says and what the kingdom you're supposed to do and all of that kind of thing. Because you want to. And this is why it seems like the sheep are so surprised. When did we ever see you that way? Right? And then he says, when you saw my brethren like this and you did this for them, you were doing it for me. And the goats, what did they not do, it appears, ever? Nothing. They didn't take care of anyone, they didn't do anything. They may have thought they were part of the kingdom, but they're as lazy as the servant with the 1 talent. Okay? And so this goes back to that idea when James talks about faith without works is dead. Right? So, okay. So, end of 25. Right now, any questions? If you have heartburn, if you need to discuss more, we can go have coffee, we can, do whatever we can. But what I want you to remember is that these set of parables are about do not delay, because everything is here that needs to be here for him to come. Be ready for it. Okay, Carl. No, because he won't have any questions when we get in the car. When we get in the car, he'll go, radio silence, So yeah. He'll say, that was good. So honey, tomorrow I think I need to change the oil and I'm gonna do this. That's right, on to the Subarus, yeah. So, okay, well ponder this, think about it, but just ponder, okay? So, shall we pray and get out of here?
What is clear though, are there are 2 things that are really clear in this, and this is something that I would love to have a round table discussion about at some point, and that is, first of all, we know that he's told us very clearly, be ready, because it can happen at any moment.
Right.
But secondly, and this is the one that I struggle with on the day-to-day, and I realize it's individual, that God will work through his Holy Spirit and show you how to live that life. But what does it look like to really live a life that's 100% sold out to God and you pursue him in everything? I want that, and yet I spend time working on the Subarus. Why aren't I down there at St. Anne's working with them? I don't know.
Okay,
Those
see,
are
that's a
questions.
question only you can answer. See, this is the thing about the individuality of the kingdom. This is the only question that the individual. How are you ready? Are you ready right now at this moment to stand before your Creator? Because it could happen at this moment. If you're not, why not? That's the whole point that Jesus is trying to get across to them. Do not think that you have to have these signs and these things that are pointing to my coming. Everything is done for me to come. The question is, are you ready for me to come? See, and I think that that's what so many times as Christians we've fallen into this thing. Oh, we can't come until then, it can't come until now, we
That's
can't
not
come
the
until
issue for me.
Well, no, not for you, but for a lot of Christians it is. He can't come until this happens, and he can't come until that happens, he can't come until this person shows up. Well, the question is that true? That's not true. He says, everything is done for me to come right now. And I'm gonna come, and it's gonna be, you guys are all gonna be carrying on life as normal. Whatever normal life is, you guys are all gonna be carrying on in it. You're not even gonna think about me coming in. Bam. And once I'm here, it's done. Whatever condition you're in, when I set foot on this earth again, that's your condition for eternity. So pay attention. And that's what he wants them to take away. Because remember, this is right after the discussion with the scribes, right after all of that. And then they move out there and they have this discussion. See, this is the thing, this is all one flowing conversation that he has had with them that day. Right, so with that, I'm gonna let you ponder this till next week. So, let's pray. Wow, Father, that is so amazing. And it is cause for us to stop and ponder how we live and what we're doing and all the things that we talked about tonight. But thank you, Lord Jesus, that you have loved us enough to tell us these truths and to remind us of what's important and to help us to remember what is the priority in our life. and that we would look for your coming at any moment, and that we would be ready for it. And not only us, but that we would be vigilant in sharing your gospel with those who need to hear it, so that they would be ready for it as well. So I just ask that you would take all of this information that we talked about tonight, that you would use it as only you can and give us understanding, that we would process it in a way that's glorifying to you and true to the scriptures that we just read tonight. And Father, that in doing all of this, your Spirit would change us, and that we would truly recognize what it is that we are here to do. And Lord Jesus, that we would proclaim your name to those who need to hear it, and we would encourage one another to endure until the end. And we just thank you that we're able to do that because of what you have done for us. So we thank you for that tonight, and in your name, we just lift up all of these